Okay. Today I want to take a slightly different tack to that I took on Tuesday. When you remember, I used the Irish famine and the Great Exhibition to illustrate not just the new principles of liberal political economy and the way in which it seemed to have become triumphant and beyond question at that historical moment, but also to demonstrate to you how it was seen to generate a very clear set of winners and losers, who would be rich and who would be poor. And that this distribution of wealth was seen to have an almost providential logic to it, that rewarded diligence and hard work. The diligent and hard-working would become the wealthy and the prosperous, and the lazy and the dissolute and the primitive and the backward would be punished by their poverty. So today, what I'm going to do is look at the principles of liberal political theory, not just political economy, but a liberal theory of politics, and I similarly want to chart its winners and losers. And so the way in which I'm going to do that today is by, again, contrasting two events. I want to have a look at two failed revolts. Okay, the first in Britain with the Chartist movement in 1848, the second in India, and particularly northern India, with the revolt of 1857, variously called the Rebellion, and in Britain known for a long time as the Mutiny, which I will return to. Now, 1848, which is the putative start of this class, was a dramatic year in the continent of Europe. Revolution swept across the continent. You see here a map, if you can see it, with a little red asterisk denoting revolutions in Italy, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in France, in Prussia, I mean across the continent. You'll notice that there is no red asterisk on Britain. And Britain seemed to have avoided the fate of the rest of Europe. In this year, 1848, Thomas Babington Macaulay, great second name, don't you think, Babington? You could think about christening your children Babington. I think that would be a great name to give them. Almost as good as Potter. Thomas Babington Macaulay wrote the third volume of his History of England. And it's a famous, very famous, popular history of England. And the third volume basically celebrates the way in which Britain, the revolution of 1688, enables Britain to avoid the revolutionary fate of the continent of Europe in the 1840s. That liberalism had been secured in the century and a half since the Glorious Revolution. And remarkably, in Macaulay's story, one of the ways in which this miracle had been achieved was with an incredibly small state. That is to say that Britain had economically modernized, it had become more politically representative, it had been socially transformed by industrialization, but it had still maintained a small state, unlike those vast repressive state apparatuses of the continent of Europe, by which, France and Prussia were always held out as the exemplary models of. So Britain, it seemed, was then a decidedly liberal and peaceable kingdom. Okay, this was the mythology at work. And so the revolt of the Chartists in 1848 and of the Indian military in 1857 proved a real decisive challenge to that point of view and to that liberal aspiration of the avoidance of revolution. And I'm going to suggest to you today it's both a decisive challenge, but it's also their failure of these revolts helped secure liberalism as the governing principle of the age. That in a way that these were the last gasps of an attempt to overturn this new set of principles that had swept through the nation. The historian W.L. Burns wrote this book, The Age of Equipoise, published, I think, in the 1960s, by which he meant that after 1848, Britain had finally found its balance, its equipoise. Okay? That the revolt had been, and this is a quote, "A dangerous night and stormy morning was succeeded by an afternoon which was sunlit and serene." Okay, so here you have the idea that after the revolt of 1848, everything is basically rosy in the British garden. Now the question is, why do these revolts fail? And one of the key themes that I'm going to be returning to throughout this lecture is trying to explain why these revolts fail and how that explanation shows key similarities and differences between the position of Britain and of India. Okay? That is to say that in both Britain and India there was a delicate balance, and often not so delicate balance, of the use of repression and the use of reform. Okay? So it was a twin strategy to try and extinguish the challenges that liberalism faced. And my point is going to be is that there's a decisive difference between Britain and India. Effectively, the story will be there's more repression in India than there was in Britain, although repression was not entirely absent in Britain. And this is what historians often use when they often describe as the rule of difference. When they talk about the British Empire, they talk about a rule of difference in which different people are subjected to different types of laws and rules and responses. Okay, so the first part of the lecture I want to do is map out how in Britain in 1848 seems apparently ripe for revolution. Why Britain was effectively in a not much different position to the rest of Europe. So the first part of this is an imperial story. And remember my lecture last Thursday, I believe it was, when I was giving you the snapshot of Britain in 1848, and I was trying to say to you one of the key things that had happened in the creation of this new society after all of these great economic and demographic changes was that authority had to be extended over further and further distances. And as authority was extended over further and further distances, so it became more vulnerable and frail. And so one of the things I want to get here is at how vulnerable Britain was at the point of 1848. Now, you see here two maps of the British Empire in 1713 and in 1850. Okay? Now, it's very often argued or assumed that after the Napoleonic War of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, that basically everything goes quiet on the imperial front in Britain. That effectively the story doesn't get exciting again until the so-called scramble for Africa in the 1880s. So there's this general assumption that effectively you have two big periods of imperial expansion, one in the middle of the 18th century and then one at the end of the 19th century. What I'm going to suggest to you, and in between, was this period dominated by the idea of an empire of free trade, where you didn't have to have formal colonization, because free trade would do the creation or imposition of free trade upon other territories would do the civilizing work and the extraction of wealth that empires are meant to be about. This is, though, a gross simplification. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, Britain was engaged in a series of colonial wars in Burma in 1824. I talked on Tuesday, I think, about the Opium Wars with China between 1839 and 41. Same dates, there's a war in Afghanistan when the East India Company is trying to extend its reach further north. And of course, there's the European Crimean War in 1854 to 1856. And there is a continuation of formal colonial, taking possession of formal colonies. So Singapore becomes a colony in 1824. Shanghai, the treaty ports of Shanghai and Hong Kong, as a consequence of the Opium Wars in 1841. New Zealand in 1840. Natal in Southern Africa in 1843. So the British Empire is expanding, and you can see from this map that it's geographically very dispersed. This is not the map that you're going to see of the British Empire in the late 19th century, where there's an almost continuous band of colonial possessions here. These are quite disparate possessions. And they're defended primarily not by British soldiers. Okay? Basically, this empire is kept together by naval power, by Britain's naval supremacy, which at this point is still primarily predicated upon sail rather than steam. So it takes a long time to get from London to Calcutta or to Auckland. A very long time indeed. So the British Empire is basically therefore forced in a position of dependence upon indigenous soldiers. Okay? It basically hires or recruits indigenous people in their colonial territories to provide military power. So, and this is obviously going to be important later in the lecture, in 1857, for instance, the British Army in India had just 40,000 British soldiers and 230,000 so-called native soldiers. Okay? So very important degree of vulnerability of this power across the imperial, across the entire empire. In Britain, the story was actually remarkably similar in some ways. I reminded you, rather I didn't remind you, I think I told you in a brilliant and compelling way, how the rapid growth and increasing mobility of the population between 1750 and 1850 had really created a new type of society of strangers. Okay? And this posed a real challenge to how it was that authority was now going to be extended over people who would not know those who held authority over them. Okay? Traditionally, authority had been mediated in sort of very personal and local ways. You knew your landlord. You knew your local key political figure. Now we're talking about large, complex urban populations where you would not have those type of familial face-to-face relationships. And there are two effective problems. One is these cities were seen to be largely godless. Okay? The Church of England, one of the key institutions that had bound a society together,